Anyway, good morning, everyone. I'm going to sort of branch out into somewhat softer fields, but where the digital era has probably had a more dramatic effect than anyone could ever have imagined, and just look at its development. Then this is looking at more broadly at the changing nature of truth, politics, security, war in the digital era, which is part of this larger transformation that we're in, and which, again, my hope is that people begin to think more about how much things have changed. The problem always is that students especially think it's always been the way it is, because they don't remember how it used to be. And even the people who are older don't remember how it used to be, because you get used to the way things are. So, I mean, one of the things that we've all heard about and what we've heard discussed is disinformation, propaganda, and that it's all over the place. Now, the question is, well, why? How is it different? Why is it that we are so worried about social media affecting us in ways, I mean, when in fact, well, I mean, what is different? State-generated propaganda in some form, or state-generated disinformation, has actually been a part of state policy on the part of some countries for at least a century. On the other hand, if you take a broader view of use of false information for political, strategic, military ends, it really, I guess the first known case of it, I mean, whether it happened or not, but at least we've all presumably read about it, is the Trojan Horse. After all, it was, if you have read the Aeneid or some popular version of it, the Achaeans went to, having fought the Troy for 10 years, left a horse as a gift. They said they had all left. That was the message, that we've gone, and well, it was a nice war, but see you later. And the Trojans all believe this, except for one woman, Cassandra, which to this day carries the kind of, I mean, her name implies someone who no one will believe. And while there was a big discussion in Troy, do we bring in the horse or not? They finally said, yeah, the Greeks are great, let's bring in the horse. And of course, in the middle of the night, the horse, which was filled with Greek soldiers, went and opened the gates, and everyone came in, and Troy was lost. The idea was actually ultimately just to get the enemy to think about something that is not true in order to defeat him. And so my general point today will be that that not the very overwhelming fact, but it's actually that the use of false information has been dramatically enabled by the same technological communications revolutions that we have seen in all other realms that we've been talking about in the previous lectures. The whole idea of reaching large numbers of people far away. Now, the way to really get a handle on how different it is to look at a Soviet disinformation campaign that took place in the 1980s. It's called Operation Denver. And you can clearly see how different disinformation operations were then as opposed to now. So in 1984, the Soviet intelligence decided they wanted to run an operation against the United States. And the idea was to blame AIDS on the CIA and how it was designed to go after Black people, and it had been developed in a US laboratory, that it had not come out of Africa as was generally believed. And so in 1985, there was the Soviets published an article in a small newspaper in India called the Patriot. And the Patriot had a circulation of 35,000, which is kind of like the circulation of maybe Eesti Express in Estonia. But I mean, this is in a country of at that time, 2 billion people. So it is really a marginal newspaper. And in fact, it was a newspaper that had been set up, paid for by Soviet intelligence expressly for the idea of spreading false information. Well, what happened was they published this article claiming that AIDS had been developed by CIA and that this was something that was designed to attack the world's Black population. And after it was published there, almost immediately it was run on Radio Moscow in English. And this didn't really get much traction. This is all 1985, keep in mind. And according to Toomas Hendrik, it got a little bit of play. It was in Finland, Sweden, in Peru, and in a couple of countries in the Middle East, but no serious English or German outlet picked it up, or French for that matter. It took a year until until there was a breakthrough. So a year from when the article appeared to when it was picked up by the Sunday Express in London, and it was carried in 30 countries around Europe. Italy made a big deal out of it. Australia made a big deal of it. So that's 1986. In 1987, it finally really broke through when it became worldwide, when basically one of the flagships of American news, CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, reported. Dan Rather then was sort of like the most serious person in US news. And then it became a big deal, and this was all around the world. And then, so we see this from an idea in 1984 to the summer of 87. We get this disinformation story finally breaking big enough that the US was truly annoyed by this. And in October of 1987, then US Secretary of State George Shultz made a point of bringing it up with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, in a meeting they had. And then it stopped. And in fact, almost immediately, given the way the Soviet Union was run, the official USSR Academy of Science came out and said, oh, this is not a true story. On the other side, 5 years later, we have Evgeny Primakov, who was then in Soviet intelligence, later on foreign minister, and then ultimately prime minister, actually gave a lecture at GIMEMO, which is the Russian foreign policies, it's kind of the academy for people who become diplomats, boasting about how this was this great thing that they had pulled off. Now, it was effective. And this used to be looked at as one of the great accomplishments of disinformation. It was effective, but it took a long time, careful planning. It took years for it to have an effect. And it was just one story. Now, compare that to where we are today, where we are drowning in disinformation, there's a whole concept of fake news, fake stories. We have conspiracy theories circulating about everything during the current pandemic. This is really blown up. We have all kinds of conspiracy theories about vaccines. We have conspiracy theories about the pandemic itself and where it started. We have lots of anti-vaccination conspiracy theories. And this is a new world. I mean, as late as 2000, when the Russians, who had figured out that the internet was kind of something you could use to spread fake stories, would in the United States, in their offices, in the consulate general and UN representation, would go to the New York Public Library, because there you could anonymously get on the internet, because like in Estonia, libraries had computers and you could log on, and they could post, and they proceeded to post various fake stories to more gullible targets, to anti-globalization, environmentalist, human rights organization, telling people that, just stories that were picked up and then would be spread by the organizations that were willing to take this up. And of course, there were all kinds of various groups that you could log on to and where that was spread as well. Now, nonetheless, this did not go far. As I mentioned before in one of my lectures, that as late as the late 90s, only 30% of Americans, then by far the most digitized country in the world, only 30% of households had a PC at home. Now, going back to that era, let's keep in mind, the only way you could at all access the internet was by having a PC, or a personal computer that was connected to the internet back then almost exclusively with a wire, via Ethernet. Wi-Fi didn't really exist. And keep in mind, this is 20 years ago. Then in 2006, 2007, we had a complete revolution. And I'm sad that this has not really been explored enough. This is because it has completely, in 1 year, things changed completely. In 2003, Mark Zuckerberg had at Harvard University, where he was an undergraduate, created the first real social media platform that was open only to Harvard males, basically. And it rated pictures of Harvard girls. Rather disgusting, yes, but in any case. But then he opened it up first at Harvard, so it wouldn't be just horny undergraduates commenting on pictures of girls, but he cleaned that up a little bit, and then everyone at Harvard had access to Facebook, and they would start writing messages to each other. About a year after that, he extended this to all of the Ivy League schools in the United States. There are 7 kind of considered elite universities Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Dartmouth, Brown, University of Pennsylvania, Cornell. Those are the 7 Ivies, and it was restricted only to them. But in 2006, having seen the success of Facebook, he opened it up to the world. Well, actually to the United States initially, but anyway, he opened it up. Again, still, this was just on PCs. In July of 2006, a new phenomenon was created by Jack Dorsey. And so in July 2006, we see Twitter come out. And in November of 2006, Google bought this fledgling little company in San Mateo, just north of Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, called YouTube. Very small little company. And so this was the birth, basically in 1 year, of what became this huge social media environment, all-encompassing environment. But back then, I mean, there was nothing in 2005. 2006, these little things were created. And in the beginning, really just followed by limited numbers of people. Then something else happened, which is the appearance of the smartphone. And initially, some of you may recall that the smartphone was initially something that was done by Apple with the iPhone, but almost immediately after that, since this was the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times, was already moving in that direction. And almost immediately after that, Google came out with their Android platform, which, as opposed to Apple, was open to anyone if you paid Google. And they both came out with their apps or their app stores. Now, if Eddie can put up, well, I guess the one of the 2 slides that I sent, and you can see there what happened. I mean, Facebook went from, you see, in the middle of 2006, it was really very small. But what happened was that Mark Zuckerberg had this major brainwave, and he said, I'm going to take Facebook and I'm going to create an app, and I'm going to put it on put it on both iPhone and Android. Now, the reason why this was important is that this was mobile, and moreover, the phone was mobile. So you're no longer stuck at home. You can use it anywhere. And the other thing, of course, is that it allowed you to hook into Wi-Fi. You could also get, I mean, it wasn't so good on 2 or 3G, which is what we had back then, but nonetheless, you could get something. But where really the effect was that if you could get near a Wi-Fi network, you could read the internet, and most importantly, Facebook. And so you see that this thing really starts taking off in 2006 with the appearance of the smartphone that gave people access to the internet. What did they do on the internet? They went to Facebook. Much of the world today, people think that Facebook is the internet. And as the cost of smartphones dramatically decreased, not with iPhone, but certainly with Androids, where you can get very cheap phones, this was a major development. You can also put up the other slide that gives you a similar view of how things developed, Elise. Hello? Am I there?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, well, if you, there's another slide as well, so you can.
I think it should come momentarily as soon as Alice is reconnected.
It should be visible. It's visible on my screen. You can't see it.
Okay, Nia, it is now, just before there was no response. So you can see in numbers concretely how it went. I mean, you went from 2006, it quadrupled. And from there on in, it has been just massive, massive growth of Facebook. And so what is different now is that you have lots and lots of people who are almost immediately accessible with stories that, as opposed to the Plan Denver, you could reach people all over the world. And so when we have this massive explosion of a new technological device accessible to everyone across the world, more or less. I mean, I think there are 4 billion smartphones around the world, and you have a platform like this. Well, you're doing rather well in terms as a company, I would say. But on the other hand, I'm not sure you're doing so well with the information space. So anyway, that's where we are. I mean, that's how we have changed. We have never, ever have there been so many people connected to any computer devices as we have now. And this has changed our information space, to use this term, so dramatically that we don't know how to deal with it. And we're only beginning to deal with it. Initially it was just everyone was on this, on these platforms, and it was great. And all the news was full of how wonderful Facebook is, not so much on Twitter. And then, of course, there was YouTube, and everyone was looking at movies of cats. This is 2008, 2009. And there hadn't been any real instrumentalization of what you could do with this, at least on a noticeable big level, until 2011. And what happened in 2011? Well, there was a protest in Tunisia against a somewhat authoritarian government. And a guy in a market who was protesting set himself on fire. And of course, protests like this had been happening completely anonymously, or at least unknown to people elsewhere, and in authoritarian regimes, never carried in the news. But what happened here was that someone filmed it with a smartphone, and it went out onto Facebook, Twitter, social media, and inflamed very much of the Arab world. We saw protests spreading like wildfire from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt, and on a massive scale. This is something completely unexpected. We saw the development and discovery of, or the spontaneous development of, mass mobilization using social media, primarily Twitter and Facebook. Various attempts were made to stop it. The Egyptian government turned off the internet and shut down Facebook and Twitter. The US government, completely sort of taken aback by this development, nonetheless said, okay, this is too cool, this is too great, this is how we're going to democratize the world. Alec Ross, who had already been hired by Hillary Clinton at that time as her social media tech person, was heavily involved in pushing US diplomats to pressure the Egyptians to allow Facebook and Twitter. And we developed this idea that yes, social media is the way of future progress, and we are going to revolutionize the world by getting people to pursue social change, positive social change, by getting together on Facebook, in Facebook groups, and thinking about how we're going to make the world better. And certainly this was in 2011, 2012, the kind of line that you were getting from, well, basically from Mark Zuckerberg, and this was a force for good, and how Facebook was revolutionizing the world to make it better, that people would all be connected. And that this was all done without the government. This is civil society organizing itself on the web. Now, I mean, it's true. That's what happened. People with no resources other than mobile phones managed to cause dramatic upheavals in the in regimes across Northern Africa and leading to Syria. Syria, I mentioned, was was one of the countries, but it's where 10 years later, we still see the effect of the Arab Spring, whereas other governments or regimes were caught more unawares by this dramatic development. In Syria, where it came a little more slowly, but they decided, unlike, say, Tunisia or Egypt or Libya, they decided to really crack down. And the result of that we see to this day, with 2-3 million refugees who have fled and so forth. Now, while this is all very nice, I mean, and I don't have any access to any government. I mean, obviously, I don't have any access to, what various authoritarian regimes thought on the inside. But I would argue, and I do, that what people in not so nice governments thought was, look at all of the change and damage to authoritarian regimes can be done by all these people who have smartphones and have no money, and are showing evidence of atrocities, evidence of evil doings by government. Well, what if we actually put the authority and the money of the state into producing the same, and in fact, have lies about it? And this was a huge development, which was to operationalize social media with large government with major government resources to push a narrative or narratives of authoritarian regimes. And of course, they're going to do far better than a lot of poor North Africans who have a smartphone can do, because they don't have anything else behind them. It's just a matter of social organization via Facebook. But now you have governments, they go, oh, great. we should use this. And in fact, that's what we began to see shortly. Now, in the case of Russia, at least, we'd already seen for several years before the use of domestic television to spin out various alternative stories and to people on TV. I mean, Russia in the 1990s was a fundamentally TV-oriented society. Most people watch TV, most people did not have, and even to this day, most people do not have a computer at home, but lots and lots and lots and lots of people have smartphones with which they can access social media. Again, here, this is my hypothesis. I mean, I don't know what the thinking was, but what we did see within a short time was the beginning, the appearance of fake narratives promoted on social media, clearly state influenced, oriented, to mess up, I would argue, to mess up the narrative that otherwise you would be getting from more serious journalists. Where we saw it really come into play was in 2013, but especially 2014, with the revolution in Ukraine, especially, well, I mean, November, December 2013, when protests really began in earnest, because the local authoritarian Viktor Yanukovych had basically decided not to develop an association agreement with the European Union, which caused massive protests, which then continued into 2014, January, February, leading to the protests getting to the point in February of 2014 that he ordered his troops to shoot protesting Ukrainians. Over 100 people died, which then led to really galvanized the population, that then led Yanukovych to flee Ukraine, followed immediately by Russia invading Crimea and annexing it within like 10 days, and starting sort of major civil disturbances in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the Donbass, what is called the Donbass, which is an area that had far more Russian-speaking people than Ukrainian-speaking, fomenting revolution there. Again, physically in situ, KGB agents, I mean, or GRU agents, I mean, being actively involved as well. But nonetheless, you ended up with what was clearly the first major annexation of territory since World War II. Now, in order to push this, we began to see major use of social media on the part of what we now realize were basically extensions of the Russian regime. As you may recall, that a lot of this, I mean, people thought then still about social media as something which is spontaneous, man in the street. This is not, governments are not doing this. When governments were on social media in an official way, they were fairly ham-fisted and primitive, and you still see this on Twitter pages. You just see like I am foreign minister. I am meeting colleague foreign minister. You have a shaking hand, you know, sitting in two flags. And that's kind of like the level of government social media is. And you just look on Twitter, look at the Estonian foreign ministry page. If you don't want to look at me, you know, you just, any government, and especially European government foreign ministry pages are just full of that country's foreign minister and some other foreign minister with their respective flags in the background. They're standing like these two dead figures and they're shaking hands. There are a lot of those of me, by the way, from the past. So I am not, I mean, I hated those, but people didn't want to, you know, do it any other way. So I mean, you can just look me up, and then you can see lots of pictures of stiff looking me with some stiff looking person shaking hands. That's what government pages look like. Now, but this was different. This is reporting on the scene. I mean, one of them, some of the more famous ones were in Ukraine, in the Donbass. They actually had crisis actors from Russia, a woman who managed to appear in all kinds of videos, always the victim of some horrible act by the Ukrainians. And the funny thing was that she would appear in different spots that were then filmed. They would be put on Russian television, but then they would also be put on social media. And the response back then was actually incredible. I mean, the Russians were incredibly successful because the Western media was not used to actually lying. I mean, they figured that if you're going to, Yak Laya saying she wore different wigs. Yes, she did that. They were not, I mean, the thing is, okay, you know, if you're BBC, you have, all right, we really take the word, I mean, we take with a grain of salt what the Russian foreign ministry says. But then you have these movies that are on Facebook with this woman crying. I mean, the worst case was a story about, from this woman who has just only this week resurfaced in Russia in a story, but a story about how Ukrainians had crucified a 3-year-old Russian boy. Total nonsense, absolute and utter nonsense. But it was filmed on the ground, and it was like reportage, and she was crying, and how horrible it was. And people believed it, and then you ended up with this standard kind of Western journalistic response, which is like, well, on the one hand, the Ukrainians say this, on the other hand, the Russians say that, and then on the third hand, the Ukrainians deny what the Russians say, and the Russians. And this went back and forth. And since you had all of this live film coverage, people bought it. The other part of this, what really emerged into social media at the time, which had also been something that had been spun a lot by domestically in Russian television, was sort of just competing narratives. Steve Bannon of America, Donald Trump's propaganda minister, took this up because he even has an expression for it. It said, flood the zone with shit. Pardon my language, but that is Steve Bannon's advice for how to disrupt standard narratives. But the Russians did this exquisitely. The best or the worst event and the best example of this was when accidentally, I guess, the Russian army shot down a MH17, a Malaysian airliner, 300 people, 298 or something were the civilian airliner died because they were just blown out of the sky by a Russian missile. And of course, this is horrible, right? I mean, you know, Russians have shot down a civilian airliner. I mean, that's about as bad as it can get. But they immediately started throwing out competing narratives. No, the Russians didn't shoot it down. It was actually a provocation by the CIA, and the plane was already filled with dead bodies, and this was all done by CIA to discredit the Ukrainian regime. I mean, there are stories after stories after stories. Well, first, initially, obviously, the Ukrainians themselves had shot down the plane, which then, sort of radar evidence showed that, no, that was not true. And then other stories about how, well, actually, the Ukrainians had meant to shoot down a Russian plane, but because the Ukrainians have bad missiles, the missile hit this instead. I mean, what you ended up with was a plethora of stories about what was going on. The result the goal was to make people say, well, is this really true? Is this really possible? Or maybe that some other story is true. And well, it's all the same. And so what this has led to in the past several years since then, I mean, since 2014, is really a degradation of the concept of truth. We don't believe things that much anymore. And because there is so much nonsense on the internet, and so many competing stories, and you have all of these various conspiracy theories, which people actually do promote. I would argue one of the results of this massive transformation that we have seen that began in 2006, 2007, where internet access combined with these platforms basically dramatically weakened our belief in the concept of truth, of empirical truth, of observable truth. Seeing is believing. I mean, this is the concept that has really kept or sort of revolutionized Western liberal democracy in the beginning, in the middle of the 18th century, when the Scottish philosophers, John Locke, David Hume, George Berkeley, sort of came up with the concept of empiricism, that against blind or dark belief, we must believe what we can see. This is called empiricism. I mean, this has been the basis of science ever since then. Now, since you can manipulate all kinds of things, I mean, you can now, through technology, manipulate what you see, that it is no longer a matter of blind belief, but you could just make things up and sort of show it on the internet. We see that people are beginning to believe in all kinds of things. And there are certain things that come out of the internet that that make it, or that are kind of features of the internet that really help this happen. And I'll just go through some of them. I mean, that allow us to see things differently. One of the things that is a result of the internet, and in Facebook especially, are new communities that never could have existed before. I mean, let's take your sort of average nutcase Nazi, sort of somewhere in some little town, there's some guy who who thinks Adolf Hitler is really great and Jews are responsible for everything bad in the world. And until like 2006, 2007, he was the weird guy that lived over there, and okay, well, he can do that, but people sort of stayed away from him and no one took him seriously. Now, via the internet, you can and have, and we've seen this dramatically, we see communities of people who share often very weird ideas. this was described in beginning, long before the internet. This was an idea of an American social theorist named Benedict Anderson, who wrote a book, published a book in 1983 called Imagined Communities, which at the time was a theory of how nationalism developed. And his argument was that what made nationalism possible was print capitalism. And print capitalism was that basically people in different languages realized they can make money writing languages in the vernacular instead of in sort of the lingua franca. And also this is directly a result of books becoming cheap thanks to movable type. And so people began reading in various dialects to understand and understood other people in their language, and then they began to form a community. That these were print languages. This was Karl Deutsch, who was another German theorist of nationalism, and wrote a book called Nationalism and Social Communication about how theater had the same role, that taking the example of the Czech National Theater in the 1870s coming about, where capital was sort of the middle class, rising middle class in then the Czech lands of, or in Prague, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, would put their money together in order to have a theater in their own language, in Czech, as opposed to theater in the German language, which was the dominant language, obviously, and where theater was performed, and so Czechs would come together. This is the identical pattern, by the way. Those of you who are listening to this who are Estonian, took place in Estonia. I mean, what is the Estonia Theater, if not a group effort on the part of a rising middle-class Estonian middle class in Tallinn, saying, we're tired of looking at all this theater and this opera in German. We want to see it in Estonian, and let's put our money together and we will build a theater where we can see things in Estonian. I mean, this is not strictly just a Czech or an Estonian phenomenon, but the point is that communication created these communities. Now, in the print era, this was kind of this. I mean, if you could pull it off with someone, that was great. I mean, so you have the development of an Estonian language community, the development of a Czech language community. The print side comes out, especially because we see that we did not have the development of a Southern Estonian language community, because Estonians ended up picking or whatever Estonians picked. But in any case, we ended up with a Bible in the Northern dialect, not the Southern dialect, which had the ancillary effect of making this literary Estonian the only Finno-Ugric language without vowel harmony. But we'll leave that there. Point is that suddenly you had a new way of forming communities, and in fact, they made it easy for you. You could find other groups that, to go back to our hypothetical Nazi, you could find other Nazis. And maybe, I mean, you would have never met these people. And these other Nazis are living, some of them are living close by, some of them are living further away. And what you do is you set up a Facebook group, and then you can get together with other Nazis. You can also send advertising to them. There was an experiment, it's just that in 2017, a bunch of journalists had already been very scared by what was developing, used the advertising function of Facebook, where if you want to sell an ad on Facebook, you put in what kind of people you want to reach. And so you put in hate Jews, like guns, sort of, I don't know, whatever attributes you have of a Nazi, but they did that. And they ended up with 3,000 people on Facebook who are clearly Nazis that you could send advertising to. So if you want to send them, whatever. I mean, I don't know what you sell to Nazis, but anyway, this is just an example of it. Now, in the case of Facebook, this was figured out by the Russian Internet Research Group, which is a troll farm in Petersburg, already very early. And in 2016, during the election, U.S. election, there were 2 Facebook groups that were set up from Russia, as it turned out later on upon investigation. But one of them was an anti-Islamic Facebook group in Austin, Texas. Well, larger than Austin, but this was kind of focused on Austin. And there was another fake Facebook group set up by the IRA, which was to integrate Muslims in the United States. And these garnered relatively large followings. And what was then done was the anti-Islamic group called for a protest on a certain day at a certain place in Austin. And then the other group, again, with a fake event, was called for a counter protest at the same time on the same day. Now, things were a little less violent back then in the United States 5 years ago than they are today. In any case, these events actually took place. There was no clash, but this is what you can create with social media today that never, ever could have happened before. This is why we're in a new era in which we can completely alter the nature of social organization and development using techniques, communication techniques that just reach massive numbers of people. Now, there are a couple of other terms, I think, besides sort of that we need to understand about the sociology of how all of this works. One of them is conformity, now conformity, we know what it means. It means you want to be like other people. There is a classic experiment from about 60 years ago by a guy, an American professor of psychology named Solomon Asch. But he did this conformity. He wanted to understand how people go along with certain ideas. And so he did this experiment where he would bring in, say, 15 people. And actually 14 of them were what you call a Confederate, rather people who were in on the experiment. And the experiment was to ask people to judge which line. We show you 2 lines to say which line is longer. And so actually there's only one person who was the subject in the experiment. The other 13, 14 were all in on it. And so what they would do is they'd show these 2 different lines. And in the beginning, the Confederates would answer normally. They say, yes, the line on the left is longer, no, line on the right is longer. And then, but slowly, the Confederates, the 13 people in on the experiment, would start saying that the shorter line was longer. And then what he found was that people, the one experimental subject would maybe disagree, but as the experiment continued and everyone else saw things differently, he would begin to agree with the rest of the group. That is called conformity. You go against your own judgment and you say, well, if everyone else is saying that line is longer, I mean, maybe something's wrong with me. I'm not. And he did a number of these experiments. Solomon Asch, its first name is Solomon, and his last name is spelled A-S-C-H, if you'd like to pursue this, Solomon Asch and his conformity experiments. And he came out with certain truths that at that time were interesting. Certainly when I read about these things in the 1970s, I said, well, it's pretty cool, but you know, how much did this work? Which has become totally relevant in the internet era. First of all, conformity tends to increase when there are more people who are in the group that sees things a different way. Conformity increases when a task that you're supposed to judge is more difficult, or put it in different ways, that when you are more uncertain or things are less clear, you tend to rely more on what other people think. It certainly helps that when other members of the group are of a higher social status. This is why, I'm jumping ahead here, but if you look at things like QAnon, when you have you know, General Michael Flynn saying, I believe in Q, that adds a lot of respect. So this is an effect that it was documented long before social media came about, but I argue that social media makes it far worse, because you now have your imagined community, this community you have found that you are part of, and these are people who believe that, you know, whatever they believe, that, you know, as Q believes that the world is run by lizard people, or people who are running a pedophilia ring in a pizza parlor, in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that turns out not even to have a basement. But if you have all these other people believing it, then you think, well, okay, it must be some truth to it. I mean, these are examples of cognitive bias. There's another kind of cognitive bias that has, I argue, has been really developed together in this context of these groups, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect. A cognitive bias is when you tend to think, you know, sort of not strictly in a straight way, but you tend to think in a certain way. The Dunning-Kruger effect is one where people think that they are smarter, more capable than they really are. Basically, it comes down to that low ability people lack the skills to realize their own incompetence. But if you're in a large community of people who are all sort of tending to think something, then the Dunning-Kruger effect can be quite devastating in its effect. People, basically people who score low on tests of grammar and logic and humor tend to overestimate how well they do on these tests. They think they're smarter than they are. And if you put it again together with this, turning to social media, if you are together with other people suffering from Dunning-Kruger effect, then this only gets magnified. And I won't say anything about Estonian politics here, just because I don't want to get in trouble. But let's look at the Trump phenomenon and look at sort of these the conspiracy theories that we have there. When you start getting people of higher social status, such as the President of the United States, endorsing ideas that really don't make any sense, and you're being followed by a large group of people, that has an effect, and that is all taking place via social media. And finally, one concept I want to address here is the Overton window, which is a concept developed in the 1960s by actually a fairly right of center sort of social theorist named Overton. But it's that the Overton window represents the range of ideas that the public is willing to accept. And you can see how these things change. I mean, what the window of opportunities. You can see it in the United States, where 100 years ago you weren't even supposed to have black and white people being in the same place together, or having this, entering the same door, or sitting in the same seats in the bus. Women voting was considered utterly fringe and extreme. To bring it close to Estonia, the idea of Estonian independence in 1986 or 87 was considered completely outrageous, something no one would ever really think of, because it was, that was just far too extreme. But well, 2.5 years later, had become a commonplace. We had the singing revolution, we had the Baltic chain, we had people, I mean, this is not only Estonia, but from Tallinn down to Vilnius, we had 2 million people from the Baltic countries holding hands in supporting independence. So clearly the Overton window had moved. And when you move the Overton window, things that previously were considered impossible suddenly become very possible, and many people begin to believe in it. Again, how do you shift the Overton window? Well, in 1988, 89, it wasn't so easy, and there was a lot of work involved in this to get people to, sort of originally samizdat or underground literature, then newspapers got a little bolder. Today, all of this can happen very, very quickly. And we've seen it even in the past year or two, I would argue, in the US, where the rise of hardcore right-wing nationalism and racism is clearly tied to social media. And so you can see these are mechanisms by which you can actually change society. And what we have seen is that society is being changed dramatically, where the medium for this change has been technological development. So, well, I don't know. I mean, let me just, I have another topic that's slightly different, but I thought maybe I could, if what I have said up till now is, it's one area, so we can answer questions, and then I could later on, if there's time, I could go on with a related topic that has to do with the rise of digitization, but not so much the social side of it.
Great, thank you. So I think we already have one first question. We can take maybe some 1 or 2 questions. Louis, do you want to put your question forward yourself, as it's also quite lengthy, and I'm not sure I would capture all of the little details that you want to put across.
Yes, thank you, Robert, and thank you, President Ilves, for a very interesting lecture. I should say I haven't read this book because it's newly published, but Chris Bale of Duke University's Polarization Lab recently published Breaking the Social Media Prism. And in short, he's arguing, from what I see from these reviews, that exposure to different opinions and opposing opinions usually come from the other side, not from within the echo chamber, and that they lead to further ideological entrenchment. I should say Bale's focusing mostly on the US, where this is arguably the most aggressive. But he's saying that
the US is also the place where they actually do research on this. I mean, there is I mean, there's a massive amount of research done, and unfortunately, almost all my examples come from the United States because there's very little research done in Europe on this.
And well, unfortunately, that's hopefully maybe we can change that. But Bale is basically saying that until people learn how to have a healthy dialogue, they should stay in like-minded company, which I could imagine would probably be argued by many, but it would seem to further intensify echo chambers. So my question to you is, I know this is a complicated question, but how would you envision a proper and useful response by liberal democracies to break the echo chamber effect and encourage and foster a healthier political dialogue in these times that you rightly pointed out are getting quite nasty, especially in the US?
Well, that's a hard one. No one's come up with it. I mean, you see that people are not willing to entertain all sort of other ideas. And here, of course, we also run into the other problem of the muddling of truth that I mentioned, what the Russians were engaged in the case of, say, MH14, is that, well, you know, I mean, all things are possible. And so that doesn't really help the, I mean, at least the confusion more than anything else. And the confusion is I think one of the problems that we face. Now, if you end up with these competing or conflicting, not competing, conflicting positions where you have your truth and I have my truth, it's very difficult to get a person to accept the other person's truth, and instead you just become more hostile. That's one of the things. This is, you know, there is a law. There's a law. I mean, it's called Godwin's law. Mike Godwin, who's actually, I think, an engineer, but in any case, in the 1990s, coined this thing now called the Godwin's law, is that any internet discussion ultimately ends up coming down to one on Hitler. I mean, that is basically whenever, I mean, the longer an argument goes on in the internet, the more likely it is that someone's going to call someone else a Nazi. I mean, and so you can look it up. Google it, Godwin's law. I mean, I don't think it's not an academic term, but he's still, by the way, alive and doing all kinds of stuff. But anyway, I mean, that's an observation of the sociology or the social behavior on the internet. And that runs against the idea of having a civilized discussion, saying, well, actually, that point you make is not right. So I think it's tough. It's going to be very difficult.
Thank you.
Great. I mean, I think this topic, I'm just looking, the topic about the echo chambers also brings up the other one. I mean, they are all linked very closely to artificial intelligence, right? So artificial intelligence, in a way, is actually creating those echo chambers because also we don't know how the algorithms work. So how would you suggest, in order to control this artificial intelligence algorithms, to avoid producing on the one hand side echo chambers, but going extreme? And in which way is control over those social media companies actually necessary also in a legal way? I mean, this touches base on what we discussed also previously.
Well, one of the problems that we do know, and Tim Wu has written on this, a lot of people have written on this, but is that the algorithms that you have in, say, YouTube or other social media platforms drive you toward greater, you want something that grabs your attention. And so you actually see algorithms driving radicalization. You may start off with pictures of bunny rabbits, but then from bunny rabbits, you end up going to something else and something else. And you end up, in the end, you can end up with fairly violent stuff. Certainly on, take a political issue, if you were to start off with saying something, you know, sort of your interest in what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and maybe, well, if you pick on something, click on something that maybe is a little more Russia oriented, well, you watch that, and then YouTube offers you another video to watch. And it's, yes, but it's a little more tough, or I mean, it's a little more sort of pro-Russian. And then it moves on and on and on. And if you just sit there and let it go the way you're, I mean, following the suggestions or the way that the algorithm picks the video for you, you're going to end up in not that long a time looking at fairly radical Russian chauvinist videos. It can go in the other direction as well. But the point is that algorithms, when they make choices for you based on what they think will take your interest, it is not in the interest of YouTube to give you something boring. They want you to keep you interested. So it will get more and more interesting. And a fair bit has been written about this. And then the whole idea of what an algorithm is doing there is a whole separate area that requires lots of research, because we've gotten to the point where if you actually ask, especially on these interest algorithms, if you ask, say, YouTube, well, how does it work? And they'll say, we don't know, it just seems to work, right? So, I mean, we have this ghost in the machine that they don't even know what's going on with, which is a pretty serious problem. I just should say also, those people who are interested in the disinformation, this is the best book that has come out. And that is by Toomas Rid, R-I-D, but it's called Active Measures, and Toomas, T-H-O-M-A-S, and Rid, R-I-D, who is a German scholar who was for many years in the UK and has now moved to the United States, and he's at Johns Hopkins. But the book Active Measures is by far the best book on disinformation that has appeared, that gives you an overview of the whole thing. I mean, basically beginning with sort of the 1920s, when it became really a fundamentally sort of, when the state really got involved in promoting propaganda and disinformation. And so, I mean, it's a whole area. I highly recommend the book for that.
Great.
Are there any other questions?
Is there any ad hoc questions? I don't have any in the chat. So unless someone comes up with one right now, I think you can continue.
Okay, now where, I talked about sort of the various mechanisms. Let's see how it's been put into effect over time. The huge success of the 2014 Russian effort in getting people confused about what was going on in Ukraine, I believe was behind this decision to actually go full bore on manipulating and affecting, at least influencing, the information space via the internet in the West. As I said, they saw, or it was clear that at least disinformation was highly effective in sort of developing anti-Ukrainian sentiment in the West, where people say, oh, they're a bunch of Nazis, and that, this, I mean, even though there was an extremely small group of hardcore, hard right people in Ukraine that did truly espouse kind of strange ideas that were not very palatable to Western democracies. Nonetheless, they are extremely small. It's an extremely small group. Yet, what we saw through the magnification first of the Russian media, but then taken up by the Western media as well, was to really create this impression that the Ukrainians were all like Azov, which is the name of the group, and that these are sort of revanchist, anti-Semitic people, and that the Russians actually are there trying to fight Nazism. It's a narrative that has been tried against the Baltic countries as well. Never really worked here, but nonetheless, it was used against Ukraine and was picked up. I mean, if you actually look at 2014, 15 newspaper accounts or sort of serious media accounts, and if you look at the US and the German and the French media, you'll see lots of people being very worried about the nasty tendencies in Ukraine towards anti-Semitism and fascism. This continues to this day, even when Ukraine today has a Jewish president, right? I mean, this is a narrative that is used by Russia. Now, but after 2014, it seems that this went beyond the Eastern European scene. And where we see a definite sort of active approach was in the Netherlands, which was tied to what happened in Ukraine, which was that Ukraine, I mean, the whole Ukrainian revolution came about because Ukraine wanted an association agreement with the European Union. An association agreement is really a very minor thing. It is basically a free trade agreement plus provisions on student-teacher exchange with European Union countries. This is not membership by any means. Estonia signed its association agreement with the European Union a decade before it joined the EU. Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia signed their association agreement 15 years before they joined the European Union. But so it's not a big deal at all. I mean, it was a big deal in Ukraine because Yanukovych was against even something like that. And because Russia was against something even like that. But through some little trick, because of the sort of vagaries of Dutch law, where a small number of people can get something put on as a referendum, in which basically it's highly suspected that that Russian misinformation and disinformation was behind it, as well as other active measures, that suddenly a small number of people got this question placed as a referendum in the Netherlands, which was, should Ukraine be given an association agreement? Yes or no? And I mean, given that in the European Union, there has never, ever been a referendum on a far, far more serious issue, which is membership in the European Union. You might see that might be a question, but even that, though, you know, Jacques Chirac and Sarkozy have suggested that has always been rejected. But now here was something, this minor free trade agreement, and do we give it to the Ukrainians or not, which began a massive propaganda campaign against Ukraine in social media in the Netherlands. Not only in social media, even Russians went so far as, well, whoever, but went so far as to have, there were Russians sort of being very disruptive with disruptive demonstrations who were not Russian. They were, they were not Ukrainians, but they were promoting Ukrainian positions, acting very obnoxiously, offending lots of people, claiming to be Ukrainians when in fact they were not. This, this hybridization, as it were, to use an overused word, but you have social media propaganda, you have people on the ground, was effective enough that the referendum didn't, I mean, sort of the referendum failed. So Ukraine did not get its association agreement, at least not off the bat. I mean, some legal finagling later on allows Ukraine to have basically an association agreement, but this was a case in which you actually got a country or managed to get the people of a country to take a position via social media, via propaganda, that in fact was for a foreign policy goal altogether different, which was keeping Ukraine away from the European Union. The effectiveness of that you could see at a far greater scale when we saw the Brexit referendum, in which the studies, I mean, the findings have not been released, apparently because they're so embarrassing, but it is nonetheless true that Russia put lots of effort into promoting the Brexit referendum, or a positive result on leaving the European Union, funded through various means, through people in the UK and elsewhere. Almost all of the money that UKIP, the UK Independence Party, spent on advertising in the United Kingdom went toward social media ads. The rise of social media ads is what really really begun to affect democracy. We saw the same thing happen with and it's far better studied in the case of the 2016 election in the United States, where Donald Trump's campaign focused almost exclusively on advertising on social media. Not only did it focus on advertising in social media, but it was very targeted advertising. Very targeted is even an understatement. There was a company named Cambridge Analytica. You can look this all up. I mean, it's caused all kinds of books to be written, but Cambridge Analytica was a company that had a contract with the Trump campaign and Facebook to do what they did was they wanted to do a psychological test, which is called the Oceans test, which is considered the best test of most effective test of personality that there is, at least certainly the most reliable one. I don't know if it's valid, if you know that term, but in any case, the Oceans test is a personality test, and it looks at 5 traits, and these are openness, there's the O, conscientiousness, that's the C, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So if you look up the Ocean test, you can read all about it and extensively. And what they did was there was a game called Farm on Facebook, which actually was used to, I mean, it was a game you played with a farm, but in any case, they designed it so they could score you on the Ocean test. This test, the results were, they had, I mean, 89 million people played this game. And so they had really detailed information on people's fears and worries. And this enabled the Trump campaign to have highly targeted, very granularly targeted ads. So if you are a Black woman worried, I mean, about sort of finances, living in in, say, Minnesota. The Trump campaign would target ads toward you about issues that you would be worried about. Sort of poverty, how bad globalization was, the purported racism of Hillary Clinton, who had made some comments about crime. So you get one kind of ad based on your personality, based on your demographic picture, what you are. If you're living in, say, Arizona, and you're a rancher, you would be bombarded with ads about Mexicans coming across the border, destroying life as we know it. If you were a religious person, you would get sort of, if you were an evangelist, I mean, there are lots of these ads that were very funny because it's kind of like, it's Jesus fighting Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton has horns on her head. So, I mean, so if you're a real Bible thumper in the United States, you would then, well, you would get an ad like that. Very effective advertising. While the Democrats kept running ads on TV, very expensive, very little effect, and very general, because everyone, I mean, TV is watched by broad categories of people, whereas people on the internet, people on Facebook got these ads. Not only did they get these ads, but these ads disappeared, because once you watched, it ceased to be there. So it was very difficult to measure. This all created a scandal in 2017, 2018 after Trump won. But in any case, it showed that social media can sway the outcome of elections. There is an entire book on how these ads were used to sway the election in 3 states. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ohio, with very minimal results, very minimal differences that led to Trump winning because of the electoral system you have in the United States of winner take all in the electoral college, and the electoral college meaning more, I mean, taking is what matters, not the popular vote. And thing is, I'm suffering from Alzheimer's here. I'm trying to see where the book is, but I will post it later or mention it next time, since it's somewhere here. Never mind. So what we see now is that you can sway elections. The other aspect of swaying elections, and which is what the last thing I really want to talk about today, is that has nothing to do with this, with social media. I mean, well, ultimately it ends up in social media, but it is the other side of manipulation of the democratic processes in the digital era. And that is hacking and doxing. Hacking is breaking into computers. I talked about that last time. Doxing is a term that is spelled D-O-X-X-I-N-G. It comes from the word document. It means publishing what you have hacked. The first real case of genuine doxing were WikiLeaks. This was when now Chelsea Manning, but in any case before Bradley Manning, had got access to a huge number of State Department cables, some 250,000 of them, and gave them over to WikiLeaks and Mr. Assange. And these were published to great embarrassment to the United States, because you were producing all kinds of private State Department memoranda. It led to, it is thought, the killings of a number of people, because a diplomat would say, file a report saying, I spoke to this person who said this, this, and this. And of course, in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, this can lead to devastating consequences. I was in WikiLeaks. I had a discussion in 2006 with a US diplomat at the time, which was very open, giving my opinions on things that I would never say in public. And then the newspaper Postimees sent Argo Idian to Norway, where the Aftonbladet, the newspaper there, had a copy of all of these things, and then found anything that related to Estonia. And the only thing you could really find was this very long open discussion that I had with a US diplomat, and my opinion on whatever I thought about Estonian politicians. And this, of course, yeah, I mean, this was used to attack me. That's okay. I mean, in any case, that's called doxing. And at the time, it was very embarrassing to the United States, but it's already something which is possible only in the digital era. If you go back to earlier cases of what is called whistleblowing, which went back to something called the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg, a guy working at basically a very smart physicist working at the Pentagon, photocopied 10,000 pages of documents and smuggled them on, gave them to the New York Times about how bad things were in Vietnam. This required work. I mean, you don't just photocopy 10,000 pages, right? Now you just download it. And in fact, all of this came from a single CD, as far as I understand, that Chelsea Manning had. Huge embarrassment. Well, okay. Next step. I mean, first of all, this was loaded by all of these kind of like anyone who didn't like the United States thought this was great, right? And next step was Edward Snowden, who then went and who took a huge, basically did not hack, but rather abused his administrator privileges to get lots and lots and lots of information from the NSA, the National Security Agency. What became public was that the National Security Agency was actually, they weren't listening in on people, but that was the impression everyone got. But they were listening in on the mobile phone of Angela Merkel, which was a little embarrassing, but basically they were doing meta-analysis and saying who's talking to whom, but not knowing who it is that's talking. But you could figure out all kinds of network data from that in the fight against Al-Qaeda. That was about 2% of what he actually ended up giving to the Russians when he defected there. And so it's thought much more these days that he was a spy. But I won't get into that controversy. I refuse to, in fact. But nonetheless, the point is that you see huge amounts of information now being used politically. That if earlier you had, yes, you had hacks and things like that. That was, you're looking for, military plans or something, but this was used politically. So first WikiLeaks, then Edward Snowden. Now, what then happened in the 2016 elections were that Hillary Clinton's server was hacked. And there's a comedy of errors that was attached to this, with the FBI trying to tell the Democratic National Committee that they had noticed that the Russians had hacked the server of the Democratic National Committee, and and leaving messages saying, this is the FBI, want to come talk to you. And the Democratic National Committee saying, oh, these crank calls, who are these people? I mean, didn't pay attention to the FBI trying to warn them. To sort of since there's not much time, basically what happened then was that the Russians, having cracked this, then gave the choice bits to Assange of WikiLeaks, who then published it. It's a whole huge story associated with this, but in the little time that we have, but basically it then became legitimized by the previous cases that, you know, Assange, WikiLeaks, publishing all this information that he has gotten. Well, in fact, he was given this information by the Russian intelligence, and this played a major role in the US election. If you read any book about the US election in 2016, you'll see how this really considered to be the big event was the publication of all kinds of internal documents from Hillary Clinton. This continued, just since it's already getting late. This we saw again in 2017 with the French election, and where Marine Le Pen was squaring off with Emmanuel Macron. Now, based on the Hillary experience, the French did something very, very clever. They took the server of Macron's campaign and they seeded it, meaning they put into it fake, embarrassing documents. So there were these wild documents with Macron's signature that, you know, he was paying bribes and doing this and doing that. But they were fake, and they were bad fakes. So the idea was let's put in stuff that really sticks out as being horrible by Macron, but let's make it so it's clearly forged. And so they had that in their server. This was basically, they assumed they would, they figured, okay, if we get hacked, we want them to take these things so we can discredit the hack. And that's exactly what happened. The Russians hacked into Macron's server. They picked out the most wildest things that were really bad about Macron and published them. And then the Macron campaign said, look at that. You take this seriously? You know, can't you forge his signature any better? And so they managed to avoid that. But it all sums up to show how much our politics has been affected in the digital era. In this case, I mean, the hacking itself was not a result of social media, but the distribution of these of the hacked materials or the doxing took place via social media. That is how it all got out there and affected elections. And it's now 11:42, so I better stop there. But I just wanted to give you this broad overview of how all of this stuff has changed the way we do democracy completely.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful end. So I would like to give the floor first to Aidan on his question about the Great Firewall.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Can you switch on your camera?
I'm having slight technical difficulties with the camera. Yeah, I was just wondering, you were mentioning basically misinformation coming from outside European networks, and obviously China seems to be the world leader with like national level cybersecurity. I was wondering who in Europe is responsible for stopping malicious outside activity from reaching President Macron's server?
No one. Well, now presumably DSG or the French intelligence is in, I mean, this is the problem I'll talk about next time, because I didn't have time to talk about today. But the problem in Europe is that all cybersecurity, I mean, cybersecurity is almost completely national, as it is in the United States and Canada. It's just the United States is big. But when you think of sort of 30 odd countries in NATO and the European Union in Europe, basically H1 is responsible for their own cybersecurity, which is a major weakness for all of us. And actually the two countries that are best in Europe, NATO, are France and especially the UK and GCHQ.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we're not in Europe anymore. So is there no move towards like a Frontex for cybersecurity?
I'm giving a talk on that this afternoon.
Excellent.
But I think it should be more, my argument, I mean, I'll be very brief, but basically I think though, if you know what Europe is about, I think PESCO is nonsense. Europe does not need its own tanks. We've got NATO, but what we should put our efforts in security into is to develop a very strong, robust cybersecurity, cross-border European cyber defense. But anyway, yes.
I think just put Estonia in charge. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry to cut you short, but we have two more questions and the time is running out. So Alexandra, you wanted to talk about Ukraine and NATO integration. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. My question goes in line with the example of the referendum in the Netherlands. So the officials in like Lithuania and Latvia and Poland are talking now about giving the membership action plan for the NATO integration of Ukraine. But of course, for that, they need to have an approval of all member states of NATO. Do you think the risks of failing this again, like in the Netherlands, are even higher? Because, well, membership action plan is way bigger than the association agreement. Or has the lesson from the Netherlands case been learned? Thank you.
No lessons have been learned from the Netherlands. Politically, it really depends on how much pressure the United States is going to put on it. I have no idea. I made a suggestion last week that the United States go to the Germans and say, well, if you want Nord Stream 2, then let's give MAP to Ukraine. I was there in Bucharest when the decision was made not to give MAP, I mean, we're standing there and Merkel saying no, and Lech Kaczynski's jumping up and down, and then George Bush says, okay, we'll do this, that we'll promise them eventual membership. We won't give them a map right now. Everyone was happy. And the main result of that solution was that 4 months later, Georgia was invaded. But that's a different issue. I don't know. I think that, I mean, what I haven't talked about today, and I hope to talk about next time, is actually debilitating cyber attacks on infrastructure, which is what Ukraine has suffered quite a bit from, and on the electrical system. And that I would sort of thinking politically, I would promote Ukraine and its experience with cyber attacks of far greater extent and damage than anything in the West to promote itself as an expert on this area and sell itself as that. And I would also, even though you're a non-NATO member, I would consider applying for membership in the NATO Center of Excellence in Tallinn, which is the NATO Center for Cyber Issues, and which has a number of non-NATO members as participating members. That means you don't get access to everything, but you're there. Austria is there, Finland's there, Japan is there. I think Ukraine should definitely be there.
Thank you.
We have our third question then from Sanshiro that would like to talk about our Operation COVID, please.
Yes, so you mentioned the Operation Denver in the Soviet times, and but the important thing for all disinformation operations, so-called active media, is there are true earthers always conceal their identity or affiliation with Moscow. And in that sense, in the Soviet times, KGB had many newspapers under control in capitalist countries, and they occasionally used these newspapers. First, they put fake news on this in the Western newspaper, then had Soviet media to cite and spread. Now, what Russia is now doing the exactly same method, because last year, NATO Stratcom started research on information laundering, philosophy of which is, we all aware that we don't watch Russian TV or Russian RT or Russian newspaper, but when we see they accept newspaper information from the Western sources, so you never realize this original sources from Moscow. So now Russian intelligence agencies put their fake news in the Western-looking websites, so many proxy sites, and then cite and they spread. So what my question is, what can we do to address this new challenge? Maybe we can make some list of these proxy fake sites, like we have the list of predatory journals in academia. What's your take on this?
Well, I should point out that in terms of information laundering, the Indian newspaper, the Patriot, 35 years ago, was a case of, or more than 35, 37 years ago, was a case of information laundering. It was published in a newspaper in India, not by a Moscow newspaper. Later on, they went back and say, what was this place that published this? Today, it doesn't matter. You saw this especially in the 2015 election, where you can, if you use Gothic script, you can make up a page that looks like a real newspaper from, there's like the Denver Register or something, or the whatever it is. You can make it up, and it looks like a newspaper. You have someone posts it on Facebook, and then suddenly everyone is sharing it. In 2015, I think there was 7.4 million fake stories shared, and there were 6.9 million true stories shared about the election. Well, what does that mean? Basically that, it comes down to the expression man bites dog, right? If it's a crazy story, people will share it. If it's Hillary Clinton talking about her economic plan, who the hell's going to share it, right? So, and with the ability to create utterly fake sites, you can't, it's very hard to track this. You can make one up today, and in an hour, you can have a page of some newspaper, pick a city, make up a fake newspaper, publish it on Facebook, have someone publish it on Facebook. The mechanism used in 2015 was that these were produced for money in Macedonia. Macedonia, the hell is Macedonia? But anyway, they would get the material. The English would be written by someone else, and they would then make up a page and publish it. So it's, one of the things that has happened is that people don't take those things so seriously anymore. People are more dubious. Kids, at least in this country, are taught not to believe everything that they see, and let's see if it's a reliable source or not. But it has changed the landscape of information forever, I would argue, yes.
Great. Are there any last questions that we have for the remaining 2-3 minutes that we have? If not, maybe some final words from your side, Toomas?
Well, I mean, the whole point of this series is that we are living in a new era. And next week, I'll talk more about how we're next month, how we're in a new era. And my main point is always the same, is that understand how different things are. I mean, campaigning, truth, security, all these things have changed dramatically, and all in your lifetimes, those of you who are here today. That even if you're the youngest person here, when you were born, none of this existed. So this is why I urge all of you to get into this field, because it is, if you're going to look at what digitization has done to society, and you do work hard at it, you'll never be without a job, because there's so much stuff out there.
Nice last words. Thank you all, and let's tune in a month's time for our next session with President Professor Ilves. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.